Hi, I'm Alden Windrow, and today I'll be giving my analysis of Sylvia Plath's The Bell Jar as the final video in my Literature of Despair series. First of all, I'll start by saying that I really loved reading this book. Many times I hear that writing in an autofictional way is not a great way to write fiction. However, it can work if it's done skillfully and especially if it's the writer's first novel. Sylvia Plath, of course, was known for her poetry and more generally as a poet. It makes sense that for her first novel that it would be autofictional, based on her own life experiences, and many authors start out that way from the writing advice of, quote, write from what you know. I personally think this is a good way to start writing because it gets you writing in the first place in a field of expertise that you know best. If you've experienced life as a CEO of a marketing company, for example, you don't need to go interview the CEO of a marketing company about what their work life is like. And does that mean every novel you write thereafter should be autofictional? I would say no. In fact, in writing an autofictional novel, if the writer is actually a competent novelist, they will start to move away from that style of writing, relying more on their imagination and their skill at creating plot, characters, etc. I will also just mention here that this is what I have experienced in my own writing after writing an autofictional novel. While I was busy querying publishers and getting rejected or hearing nothing at all from them, I heard that I should be working on my next novel. I didn't even have an idea of being a novelist at the time, but I decided, okay, let's see if I have anything else to say. I wrote the first draft of a second novel and was surprised that I had more to offer simply by relying on a made-up story out of my imagination more so than personal experience. The reason I wrote a novel in the first place was out of frustration, the same kind of frustration that Plath experiences throughout the formative years of trying to get a career established. She also put her novel out initially through the use of a pen name for the sake of protecting the identities of real people in the novel that she fictionalized. When I read this novel, I found so much of her experience resonating with my own, which is why I really took to this novel and found it very engaging. In the foreword by Frances McCullough, she says that when Plath's book came out, it only received lukewarm reviews and that, quote, Plath was deeply stung by them, but she had already begun another novel the previous spring, and by her mother's account, there was yet another finished one that went up in a bonfire one day when Plath was in a rage. So we do know that she did plan to write more novels. If you want to hear a good opening sentence to a novel, it starts like this, quote, it was a queer, sultry summer, the summer they electrocuted the Rosenbergs, and I didn't know what I was doing in New York. This sets the somewhat bleak tone and setting in the summer of 1953, establishing early on Esther's sense of confusion. Even though she may be where she's supposed to be, there is no certainty about her situation or her future because she has no confidence. Within the first page, we already get a sense of her disappointment where she says, quote, all the little successes I'd totted up so happily at college fizzled to nothing outside the slick marble and plate glass fronts along Madison Avenue. And then she says, quote, I was supposed to be having the time of my life, but we know already that she's not. Quote, I was supposed to be the envy of thousands of other college girls just like me all over America. But whatever envy they are supposed to be feeling towards her amounts to nothing. She does not feel any better off for being where she is in life. Her picture in the magazine that shows, quote, look what can happen in this country is all an illusion. One thing I really enjoyed in my reading of the book was catching glimpses of the poet Sylvia Plath coming through in some of the book's descriptions of characters and the landscape. For example, Esther describes herself as a, quote, numb trolleybus, bumping from her hotel to work and to parties and back to the hotel, etc. She describes herself as feeling, quote, very empty, the way the eye of a tornado must feel. Esther continually describes her feelings as that of a person sinking into depression, especially when comparing herself to her superficial friend Doreen, who appears to be having a great time jitterbugging while Esther feels like she's shrinking. And then later she describes how she's starting to feel incapable of doing what she ought to do. Quote, I told Doreen I would not go to the show or the luncheon or the film premiere, but that I would not go to Coney Island either. I would stay in bed. After Doreen left, I wondered why I couldn't go the whole way doing what I should anymore. This made me sad and tired. And then I wondered why I couldn't go the whole way doing what I shouldn't the way Doreen did, and this made me even sadder and more tired. Esther doesn't fit in well with the pre-made American template for success for a young woman her age. She's not someone who shows no promise to begin with because she does very well in school and is active as editor of the literary magazine and secretary of the honor board. But JC, her boss, calls her out when she asks Esther, quote, doesn't your work interest you, Esther? And we know by Esther's somewhat desperate answer that she has no real interest in what she's doing, while at the same time trying to convince JC that she really is interested. Quote, I'm very interested in everything. The words fell with a hollow flatness onto JC's desk, like so many wooden nickels. There's an interesting conversation between her friend Buddy Willard about whether or not doctors and poets can be friends, since Buddy is in school to become a doctor. She remembers this conversation where he calls a poem, quote, a piece of dust. But a year later, she thinks of an answer to his remark. Quote, so are the people you think you're curing. They're dust as dust as dust. I reckon a good poem lasts a whole lot longer than 100 of those people put together. And of course, Buddy wouldn't have any answer to that because what I said was true. People were made of nothing so much as dust, and I couldn't see that doctoring all that dust was a bit better than writing poems people would remember and repeat to themselves when they were unhappy or sick and couldn't sleep. It's very hard to prove this kind of argument, especially to someone like Buddy or anyone that sees poetry as impractical to the kind of career Buddy is pursuing. We see Buddy trying to join the two by reading doctors who happen to be writers also, but Esther has a very different mindset, one that wants to write poems and sees the value in them in a way that I don't think Buddy or most of the other characters in the book see them. For them, the purpose of writing is more career-oriented and in Esther's case, fashion-focused. It's not about writing poetry, even though we know this is what she would rather be writing. In Chapter 7, Esther ruminates on her shortcomings, like being unable to cook. I didn't know shorthand either. This meant I couldn't get a good job after college. My mother kept telling me nobody wanted a plain English major, but an English major who knew shorthand was something else again. The problem is, she sees this as a way of serving men, and she didn't want to do that, but to write her, quote, own thrilling letters. So she sees shorthand as some insignificant skill that doesn't really serve her ambitions. But then she goes on more about what else she can't do, like dancing or singing. She finds herself stuck in these trains of thought leading downward to depression, focusing on all that she can't do, and whatever she can do is not validated by the rest of the world, which is why she feels like, quote, a racehorse in a world without racetracks. Then we have this beautiful description where she compares her life to a fig tree. Quote, I saw my life branching out before me like the green fig tree in the story. From the tip of every branch, like a fat purple fig, a wonderful future beckoned and winked. One fig was a husband and a happy home and children, and another fig was a famous poet, and another fig was a brilliant professor. But the problem is she can never decide which fig she should choose because, quote, choosing one meant losing all the rest. And as I sat there, unable to decide, the figs began to wrinkle and go black, and one by one they plopped to the ground at my feet. And this again is where the depression starts to really hit home for her, watching herself unable to decide and feeling the devastating consequences of that. She returns back to this theme constantly that she doesn't just want to be a housewife, which is also a more general statement about the difficulty of breaking out of the expected norms for women during this time. She knows that, quote, in spite of all the roses and kisses and restaurant dinners a man showered on a woman before he married her, what he secretly wanted when the wedding service ended was for her to flatten out underneath his feet like Mrs. Willard's kitchen mat. Despite people like Buddy Willard trying to convince her otherwise, she doesn't trust that having children will get rid of her desire to write poems. In Chapter 8, we again get this description of Esther's mind state on Christmas as feeling, quote, dull and disappointed. And when they drive past the fir trees on the gray hills, she finds them looking black while she grows gloomier and gloomier. And when she poetically describes Eisenhower's face in the middle of a magazine as looking like a fetus in a bottle, we know her mind is projecting negativity onto otherwise relatively innocuous things. It's like she's seeing everything, even unrelated things, as connected to her womanhood as a psychological trap. The fetus in a bottle might be similar to the shape of a bell jar also, the type that doesn't have a cap that you can unscrew and escape from. She fantasizes about being accepted into a summer writing course, but her mother informs her that she didn't make it. She describes this news as having the air punched out of her stomach. The car they're riding in becomes like a, quote, prison van. All through June, the writing course had stretched before me like a bright, safe bridge over the dull gulf of the summer. Now I saw it totter and dissolve, and a body in a white blouse and green skirt plummet into the gap. Then my mouth shaped itself sourly. I had expected it. I slunk down on the middle of my spine, my nose level with the rim of the window, and watched the houses of outer Boston glide by. As the houses grew more familiar, I slunk still lower. As I'm reading this, I'm sensing how Esther is dissolving as her hopes and expectations crumble before her. These are crucial decisions with consequences, and these kinds of disappointments chip away at her outlook on life, making her feel more and more trapped and eventually desperate to get out of her situation. Although usually I try to distance the main character from the author, it's hard not to make the connection here of Plath herself trying to be accepted as a writer, and more specifically as a novelist. Esther decides to spend her summer writing a novel instead, as she thinks, quote, that would fix a lot of people. Her heroine, named Elaine, would be herself in disguise. So we have this meta-reference paralleling Plath's writing about herself as Esther. But then that raises the question, is Esther a heroine in this book or a victim? I think she could be seen as both. As Esther attempts to write this novel, she thinks that she hasn't experienced enough of life to write anything until eventually she decides to put it off and also puts off learning shorthand, thinking she would never have to use it. She thinks of putting off college and sees her life as a series of telephone poles, but can't see beyond the 19th one. She can't sleep or read, and finally she's directed to see the psychiatrist, Dr. Gordon. In my view, Dr. Gordon is not a good psychiatrist. Esther has good reason not to like him since he seems conceited, lacking insight into Esther's psychological makeup. Instead of giving her the therapy she needs, he tries to convince her that nothing is really wrong with her, only that she thinks there is something wrong with her. The evidence that he is not at all a good psychiatrist shows in Esther's decision to selectively disclose what to reveal about herself to him. And during this time period of the 50s, psychiatrists were not as skilled at handling patients' mental issues, especially when it came to women. Their emotions were not validated, and complaints about depression were prone to be dismissed as hysteria or over-emotionality. This is in alignment with the broader social context of the 1950s, where gender roles were rigid and women were expected to be primarily wives and mothers. They also turned to medication over therapy, and as in Esther's case, shock therapy was also used. Dr. Gordon lacks empathy and understanding of the patient, tapping his pencil while Esther is talking and asking irrelevant questions like, quote, "Where did you say you went to college?" Again, dismissing Esther. Since she doesn't seem to get better under Dr. Gordon's care, she is entered into the psychiatric hospital where she receives shock therapy. Again, though usually we separate the novelist from the story, we know that in real life, Plath had mental health issues, struggled with attempted suicide, and also underwent shock therapy. After her first round of shocks, Esther wonders, quote, "what terrible thing it was that I had done." I think this is a turning point where she begins a real descent into the medical system and psychiatric treatment. Humorously, Esther says she's done with Dr. Gordon, and her mother replies that Esther is not like those, quote, "awful dead people at that hospital." But that's just a momentary stay. She may be done with Dr. Gordon, but not with shock therapy. She contemplates how to end her life in different ways that she can't follow through on, almost fantasizing about it, but, quote, "the person in the mirror was paralyzed and too stupid to do a thing." She thinks drowning is, quote, "the kindest way to die and burning the worst." She contemplates what it would take for her to be sent to prison, a place she would feel safe being locked away in. Eventually, she tries to hang herself, but is unsuccessful because of being poor at knots, with, quote, "no idea how to make a proper one." What she discovers is that it's not so easy to physically end one's life, no matter how much one fantasizes about it. She confirms her symptoms in abnormal psychology books as being among the, quote, "most helpless cases." Then she goes back to the idea of being locked up, not in a prison, but in a psychiatric hospital, and this is the seed of her plan going forward. Quote, "I wondered after the hanging fiasco if I shouldn't just give it up and turn myself over to the doctors. And then I remembered Dr. Gordon and his private shock machine. Once I was locked up, they could use that on me all the time. And I thought of how my mother and brother and friends would visit me day after day, hoping I would be better. And then their visits would slacken off and they would give up hope. They would grow old. They would forget me. They would be poor too. They would want me to have the best of care at first, so they would sink all their money in a private hospital like Dr. Gordon's. Finally, when the money was all used up, I would be moved to a state hospital with hundreds of people like me in a big cage in the basement. The more hopeless you were, the further away they hid you." Esther reaches the point where she just wants to disappear and be forgotten about, and if she can't physically end her life, the next best thing is to disappear into a private mental hospital. She feels a hopeless case, someone who can't even deliver flowers correctly in a maternity ward, as one of the women in the ward complains that Esther had, quote, "loused up my yellow roses" after making an attempt to improve the flower arrangements by throwing out the ones that looked dead. There's a touching moment where she visits her dad's tombstone in the graveyard and cries in the rain, realizing that she has never mourned her father's death. Maybe this is because she now feels much closer to death herself and realizes what her mother had said about it being a good thing that he died rather than become, quote, "crippled and an invalid for life." Esther herself feels the same crippling emotional pain, enough to want it to come to an end, feeling, like her father, that she too would be better off dead. In another attempt, she tries to take pills and hides herself away in the cellar of the house, waiting to die. She sees red and blue lights flashing before her eyes before she lays down. And when she wakes up in the hospital after briefly thinking she is blind, she tells her brother that she feels, quote, "the same." She feels the indignity of being recognized by someone from her church who is now a doctor and tells him to, quote, "get the hell out and don't come back." Because honestly, this is what it's like when you're suicidal. This is what it's like to fail at it. she's angry. People come into her life trying to help, but she doesn't want their help. What she wants is to be gone, not recognized by people from the past. And after she breaks a mirror, she is moved to another hospital, one that has a special ward, fulfilling her vision of being locked away in a hospital. But not long after, in the next hospital, she wants to get out, not enjoying her stay there. Eventually, she moves on to a hospital known as Kaplan that she describes as being more country club-like. Her mother tells her she should be grateful to Mrs. Guinea for taking her out of the previous city hospital ward. But Esther thinks, quote, "If Mrs. Guinea had given me a ticket to Europe or a round-the-world cruise, it wouldn't have made one scrap of difference to me, because wherever I sat, on the deck of a ship or at a street cafe in Paris or Bangkok, I would be sitting under the same glass bell jar, stewing in my own sour air." This is where we get the book title from, the feeling of imprisonment she cannot escape from no matter where she goes. In this hospital, her doctor is a woman named Dr. Nolan, and people at this hospital play badminton and golf, making Esther think at first that they aren't really sick. She meets a girl named Valerie that seems to have nothing wrong with her in Esther's estimation of her. But later we find out she's had a lobotomy, which explains what Esther describes as her, quote, marble calm. Dr. Nolan finds out about Esther's shock therapy and calls it a mistake, confirming that there shouldn't have been blue flashes and jolting and noise. She says that it should be like going to sleep. This whole process becomes very difficult for Esther's mother. Eventually, she starts asking Esther what she did wrong in raising her, but I don't think that's the problem. Her mental health can't be reduced to her mother's parenting or toilet training. Her mental health struggles are far deeper and complex than that. She does undergo electrotherapy again under Dr. Nolan's care and describes it as chalk being wiped out on a blackboard. When she wakes, she is surprised to find herself feeling at peace with, quote, "the bell jar hung, suspended a few feet above my head," which describes a kind of lifting of her mood. The bell jar is not so clamped down and oppressively inescapable in that moment. She's able to breathe the, quote, circulating air. Esther agrees that it's like Dr. Nolan said it would be, and she begins regularly scheduled shock treatments there 3 times a week. Later, she finds her friend Joan in the same place. There's a strange sequence of events where Esther loses her virginity. The experience is nothing but painful for her, with lots of blood. Joan has to call the doctor to help her, and then we learn that Joan has hung herself in the woods. I think that Joan is one of the few characters that Esther could relate to, in the sense that they are both desperate and trying to find a way out of their unhappy circumstances. I also think that Joan may better represent the author herself in this instance compared to Esther, since Plath couldn't have had this happen to Esther without bringing her story to an end. We know how Plath's life ended, which is why I think Joan is the manifestation of the author's true wish to end it all, even if it was a subconscious wish at the time of her writing the book. Although we don't hear about Esther being envious of Joan, she does succeed in what Esther fails to do. We do hear from Buddy later that he suspects he may have been responsible in some way since he dated both Joan and Esther, but Esther dismisses the notion. But I do suspect that maybe from a broader perspective, Buddy might represent an older generation's relationship dynamic between men and women, where the men dominate everything, causing metaphorically and literally the destruction of women's hopes and ambitions, creating lives of severely limited choices, leading them to their deaths. It's not that Buddy in particular causes Joan's death, but his ways in general represent a larger unbecoming view of men, he both directly and indirectly may contribute to the craziness he is speaking of when he asks Esther about his responsibility in their relationships. The reason I feel Buddy may not fully represent what we might call the dominant patriarchy of the past is how uncertain he seems of himself, as Esther notes the look on his face as that of a, quote, man who often does not get what he wants. But there is that last stinging question of his when he asks, who will marry Esther now that she's been in psychiatric hospitals? Men are not portrayed all that well in this book, as we see them as kind of flaky and irresponsible. For example, Esther has to call Erwin the man she loses her virginity to, since he neglects to write the check for emergency attention, which he had been at least partly responsible for and was in a much better position financially to take care of. And then he has the audacity to think he's going to keep seeing Esther. The ending remains unresolved. The bell jar still a threat to the future as Esther says goodbye to Valerie. Quote, how did I know that someday, at college in Europe, somewhere, anywhere, the bell jar, with its stifling distortions, wouldn't descend again? In this last scene, she is ready for the evaluation from the doctors who will determine if she's ready to leave or not. I see this also as an opportunity for the reader to decide whether Esther is ready or not to face the world again. I somewhat have my doubts, but it is open-ended. Maybe there is still hope for Esther. Ultimately, though, I want to bring it back to the question of whether or not we can have empathy for someone like Esther as well. Do we see Esther as a victim or a heroine, or both? She has a tough struggle to break through societal expectations for women, choosing the harder path of pursuing a writing career. In a way, she is a rebel who rejects societal constraints on women in an attempt to shape her own destiny. But she may also be seen as a victim, someone who cannot overcome the blocked opportunities for women, causing her to suffer from depression and mental breakdowns. She becomes a touring patient in the psychiatric hospitals, a victim of societal pressures and limited options leading to unfulfillment. The pressures to get married and become a mother are imprisoning to her. She struggles with her own self-worth and feels isolated and disconnected from those around her who do not share her vision or ambition for women seeking to carve out their own identities as writers. Quote, to the person in the bell jar, blank and stopped as a dead baby, the world itself is the bad dream, a bad dream. She's describing those who feel trapped by society, a society that punishes those who fall out of line, who are dissatisfied with fulfilling pre-established roles, the punishment being deep depression and alienation from others around them. For those who cannot fit into established roles or find their place in the world, life can indeed become a nightmare. Generally speaking, I really enjoyed the reading of this book and didn't find Esther as annoying as some other reviewers have made her out to be. Instead, I found myself resonating with the bleak outlook she seems to be trapped in. It's important to hear stories about people who fail at life as much as it is to hear about those who succeed. The stories of those who don't succeed may have more to teach about the shortcomings and injustices of society, and if we truly care about humanity, we will not ignore the stories of those who struggle in favor of only those who succeed. Sylvia Plath was working on another novel before she took her own life. It's tragic because some may argue that she was never truly a novelist when she never had the chance to prove that she could do more, and we'll never really know. In the foreword, Frances McCullough writes, quote, it's heartbreaking to think of what she would have written, what wisdom and maturity would have brought to this stunning voice. I'll just throw it back to you. Have you read The Bell Jar? Were you able to find empathy for Esther despite all of her imperfections? In what ways are people still trapped in bell jars these days? In my view, mental illness is not a personal failure, but a symptom of a broken and alienating system that we have to live in. We're all dealing with our own bell jars in different ways that may look slightly different from the 1950s, but they're still there. If we choose to ignore the presence of these bell jars, being trapped in them is simply accepted as a part of life because we never see their clear boundaries. But when we are conditioned to live in bell jars, never realizing the ways we are trapped by an inhumane society, they simply warp our perception of ourselves and the world around us. If you have any other thoughts or insights, leave a comment below. And so this will end the three-part series on despair in literature. While I will be moving on to other books, we will no doubt continue to see despairing characters in books. And if you like this book, I would encourage you to also read my book, which is also autofictional, The Cancelled Life of Xander Walbach. I read The Bell Jar after writing my first draft and found many eerie similarities. The link to the book is below. Thanks for listening, and I'll talk to you next time.